Hi, I'm Brian Phillips with the Texas Institute for Property Rights. Welcome to our mini-course, Considering the Full Context. We are all probably aware of the fallacy of dropping context. The classic example is to selectively quote someone. When this occurs, some of the words that a person has written or spoken are used in such a way that misrepresent the intended meaning. When we speak or write, we don't speak or write in disintegrated sentences. Our sentences are part of a bigger whole, and combined they provide the full meaning of what we're trying to convey. So when we drop context or don't consider the full context, we're just taking bits and pieces and it misrepresents the intended meaning. And the same is true of policies, and when we consider policies, we have to consider the full context because there's much more than just the problem that it purports to address or solve. If we consider a policy out of context, then it might seem appealing, and this can lead us to bad decisions. So what is the full context? Well, it includes a number of things. One is all of the alternatives that are available or that are possible. If we don't consider all of the alternatives, then we're not aware of all of the choices that are available. The full context also means rejecting biases. Often we lean towards certain types of solutions. Maybe we believe that government should be involved in solving problems, and so we might have a bias towards a government solution. So we have to be careful when we're analyzing policies to recognize when we have these biases and put them aside so that we can address and consider all of the alternatives without being influenced by a bias. We also have to look at the long-term consequences of a policy. A policy might solve a problem today, but create other problems down the road. So we want and need to look at what those long-term consequences might be so that we can make the best decision possible. And finally, the full context includes the principles involved. The principles are the means by which we can identify what some of the long-term consequences might be. During many policy debates, we are often presented with false alternatives. As an example, when zoning was being debated in Houston in the early 1990s, zoning advocates told us that we had the choice between zoning and that accompanies zoning or the chaos and anarchy of what we had at the time, or at least that's how they depicted what we had at the time. So we were given this alternative between government control over land use or chaos and anarchy. Often, the advocates of property rights violations will ignore pro-freedom alternatives. They see some problem or an alleged problem and immediately look to government for a solution. And they don't even consider loosening controls, loosening land use regulations or building codes or other government restrictions that might be contributing to the problem. And similarly, they often exaggerate the problems to make it look as if fewer restrictions are contributing to the problem or causing the problem. Now, alternatives aren't always obvious, and this is particularly true if we're not an expert on a subject. It's certainly not incumbent upon us to come up with concrete, specific alternatives to address an issue. If we're not an expert on a topic, that's just beyond our knowledge and ability. For example, I know a fair amount about education, but I'm certainly not an expert on education. So I could not begin to identify specific, concrete alternatives if I was trying to address issues regarding education. But the important point that we can make is that free individuals, and only free individuals, do solve problems. They do find ways to meet the needs and desires of other individuals. So that's what being in business is all about, is identifying a need or desire that isn't being fulfilled. So we can certainly make that point, that if we give individuals freedom, they will find solutions. But we can also look at the historical and contemporary records to find alternatives or examples of alternatives. And I'll put in a plug for my book, Individual Rights and Government Wrongs, because in that book I provide dozens and dozens of examples of how private individuals and businesses have provided services that we often think only government can provide. And these examples are from many different industries, from many different cultures, over a couple of hundred years of history. So in the book I showed that free individuals do solve problems, often in innovative ways that would never occur to us. And we can certainly use those as examples of alternatives to make our point that freedom will help us address these issues. Many times in debates over property rights issues, there's an underlying bias that may or may not be obvious, but it still can influence the discussion. So it's important to recognize signs that bias is creeping into the discussion. And this can occur no matter what our position is on a particular issue. But it's particularly prevalent among those who would violate property rights. In those instances, they tend to only look at the negatives of the current situation. When they want to violate property rights, they're advocating for more government controls and restrictions, and so they point to the absence of those controls and restrictions as evidence that freedom creates problems, that we need more controls, government controls and regulations. So they'll point to the current policy, which is the absence of their proposal, and argue that that is the cause of the problem. And they often exaggerate the problem, making it sound catastrophic, like the world is about to end because there aren't the controls and regulations that they propose. And on the flip side, they will often only look at the positives of their proposal. They'll argue that it's going to solve some problem or some alleged problem, and fail to recognize or even consider some of the negative consequences. So even if the defenders of property rights raise legitimate objections, the advocates of restrictions and controls often just simply dismiss those objections and refuse to address them. And again, to use the debate over zoning in Houston, when the opponents of zoning pointed out the problems that zoning caused in countless other cities, the advocates of zoning simply dismissed them as lies, scare tactics, and misrepresentations. They refused to recognize and admit that there are legitimate objections to zoning. Also, the advocates of land use regulations and other property rights violations have a bias towards government intervention. When they see a problem, they think there should be a law to address that problem. They don't like how people are using their property, and so they think that the only way to stop that is for government to intervene and enact regulations and controls. They believe that individuals won't do the right thing voluntarily, so they should be forced to do so. So when we're engaged in property rights discussions, we want to be aware of some of these biases so that we can address them and try to keep them out of the conversation. If we're going to discuss all of the alternatives, then we need to do that with an open and even-handed consideration. Another aspect of the full context are the long-term consequences of the policy we are discussing. Today's policies do have long-term effects. If we pass a restriction or a law today, that's going to be passed on to future generations. And the repercussions and consequences may or may not be desirable. So we need to be able to look down the road, to look to the future and identify what those consequences might be if we're going to make a good decision. Simply because a regulation or an ordinance addresses a problem today doesn't mean that it won't cause additional problems in the future or have other undesirable effects. As an example, bond elections impose obligations, financial obligations, on future generations, and as well as individuals who don't even live in the jurisdiction voting on the bond. So, in effect, we're imposing, when we vote or pass a bond election, we are imposing a financial obligation on future generations. So if we're going to consider the full context, we need to look at these long-term consequences and determine if they are desirable. If we fail to do that, to adequately do that, we may not make the best decision for the long term. It might seem good today, but in the end turned out to be much more destructive than we envisioned. The final aspect of the full context is identifying the principles underlying the issue. A principle is a general truth. It is widely applicable to a broad range of specific, concrete situations or issues. Now, unfortunately, many times those who are trying to defend property rights accept the principle underlying the proposed regulation or ordinance, but simply argue that it goes too far. And this just sets us on a course for future destruction, because if the principle is accepted, then that principle will be applied in an expanded fashion down the road. Now, if we identify the underlying principles, we can project the future, because we can see how the principles will be applied in the future. Logic demands that a principle be applied consistently. It may be applied narrowly or inconsistently today, but over time, the advocates for that particular issue will demand that it be applied more consistently. And this means that the application will be expanded. We can see this time after time in regard to property rights issues. Take the anti-smoking movement as one example. When the movement first became active, many of their demands were aimed at offices. They tried to get smoking banned just in offices. It was a narrow application, but it established the principle that government could regulate the activities that occur in private property. And the defenders, or the alleged defenders of property rights, often accepted this because the application was narrow. But because the principle of government control had been established, over time the anti-smoking activists demanded that it be applied to more and more businesses. And the defenders were disarmed. They couldn't claim a violation of property rights because they had already surrendered that argument previously when they accepted the principle of government controls and regulations. So over time, the anti-smoking movement incrementally expanded where smoking was banned, and in time they pretty much got it banned, in all indoor venues that are open to the public. So if the principles underlying that movement had been identified and publicly stated or explicitly stated, the defenders of property rights would have been able to more effectively stop that movement before it gained any traction. But because the principle was accepted, the battle was over from the very beginning. Explicitly and clearly naming the principles underlying property rights issues is crucial. Doing so works to the advantage of the defenders of property rights. If we make those principles explicit, they are much easier to defend, and we put those who would violate property rights on the defense. They must defend the principles that they are advocating. But if those principles remain hidden, if they remain unnamed, and unnamed explicitly, then those who would violate property rights are essentially hiding. They're hiding the true meaning of what they are proposing. Also, if we name the principles, we can better project the long-term consequences of a given proposal. We can show the logical progression of that principle as it is applied to other issues. Explicitly naming the principles also provides clarity. It helps us identify the standard that we are using to judge a particular proposal and whether that proposal will actually satisfy that standard. It helps us establish greater precision in addressing the issues that we are discussing. If we want to make better decisions, then we have to identify and explicitly name the principles underlying the issue. That will help us decide if we're going on the right path. Is this what we want to enact today? And will we have desirous consequences in the future? Or are we simply solving a problem today at the expense of the future? Principles are a part of the full context. And if we want to consider the full context, all of the aspects of the issue, then we must identify the principles involved.